Hey, what's up, guys? Today, a longer video. I know I've been doing a lot of Philosophy Fridays lately, little 60-minute tidbits of a different topic in philosophy every week, or I try to do it every week. If you're not familiar with that, I recommend you check that out on my channel. But today, I'm going to do something a little different. I just completed my master's degree in philosophy at the University of Buckingham, and I wanted to give just a description of that program and why I would highly recommend it. It's a very unique program at a very unique school. It was, again, at the University of Buckingham in England, the main campus of which is in the town of Buckingham, north of England, near Bicester. And it's, maybe a half-hour train ride from the Ring in London. My program was in the center of London. It was part of the Humanities Research Institute at the school. It's one of their special little one-year London programs. One of the things that makes the University of Buckingham unique in general is their accelerated degrees. They have a different philosophy of teaching and education, which allows you to condense your studies into the minimal amount of time that it really should take for you to gain the knowledge and expertise that you would in any given field. So for a master's degree like I got, it only took 1 year instead of 2. You can get a bachelor's degree in 2 years instead of the typical 3 in England or 4 in the United States. It's the oldest private university in the UK and the only one that has royal funding. It does not rely on any public funds, but it receives most of its funding from the royal family and from private donors as well. And its research produces income as well that's fed back into the school. So that's unique. Structurally, these accelerated programs, that might be a selling point for them, and is, I think. But also their emphasis on open discussion and the free expression of thought and ideas. They're big proponents of free speech, probably the least politically correct school in Europe, as it's been described. And because of this, I think it has gained a reputation of being one of the best schools for teaching anywhere. It's won a lot of awards for teaching, for student satisfaction. Over the last 10 years, it's probably the most decorated school in those categories in the United Kingdom. And it attracts professors and visiting professors from all over. And that's one of the things that definitely made my program unique. Pretty much everyone who was involved in my MA in philosophy was there on a part-time basis, almost a volunteer basis, although they do get paid. But they're there because they share the philosophy of teaching and education that the school offers. And my program was a bit different from most master's programs that you'll find anywhere in the world, I think. And there's a general consensus of everyone who's involved there, even if they're a visiting professor from, say, Oxford or Cambridge or King's College London. There is a general consensus that it's probably the best master's program in philosophy in the world because it's different, because it takes you back to the roots of when philosophy began. So instead of having traditional coursework that you do for a grade, it's more seminar-based. It's open discussion, symposium-style discussion on all the major topics of philosophy, with absolutely no limits on what you can say or what you can ask, regardless of how ridiculous your thoughts might be. Everything's discussed openly in a symposium style, in an old-fashioned Greek forum-style debate. And so that's how my program was. It consisted of 12 seminars covering all the major topics of philosophy. Some of them, probably about half of them, were led by Sir Roger Scruton himself. He's the program director, or by a guest who is an expert in whichever topic we were discussing, and Scruton as, say, like a secondary lecturer or talker. So we did have a wide range of different thinkers, experts in these different topics who led our seminars, including but not limited to Anthony O'Hear in, I think, maybe no, not metaphysics. I don't remember. Anyway, Sebastian Gardner, existentialism. He was great. Jane Heel did logic. She was great. And number of others. Simon Blackburn, I think, did philosophy of science. That was a good seminar. So the structure went like this. We met at the Reform Club in central London. It's this old, beautiful building, 18th century gentleman's club, and which is open to ladies nowadays, But we met in one of the meeting dinner rooms there. Whoever was leading the discussion gave about an hour and 15 or 20-minute talk on whichever topic we were covering, and then we retreated to the wine room while they set the table for dinner, and we'd have more casual chit-chat over wine, and then return to the dinner room once that was over, once the table was set, and have a excellent 3-course meal while we openly discussed whichever topic was on the night. And there was a general sense of openness, willingness to learn about whichever topic we were discussing. And there were readings, of course. They weren't necessarily required, but if you wanted to contribute anything to the conversation or come up with any questions of your own, it was a good idea to do the readings. The more you put into it, the more you get out of the discussions. And the point of these seminars wasn't necessarily to get a grade. It was to learn something, make your thinking more well-rounded, open you up to a topic that maybe you hadn't been interested in before. And I think a lot of people who were in my program, it was, I think, only 14 of us. A lot of us had read a lot of Scruton's work. And, of course, he's an expert in political philosophy and aesthetics in particular. And so lots of people did their dissertations on one of those topics, which leads me to the next point. Although we didn't get graded for each seminar and our performance in the discussion, because that'd be a very difficult thing to quantify, we did have a dissertation or a thesis of about 25,000 words that we had to complete, and it was either advised by Scruton alone or by one of his colleagues, and also by Scruton as a secondary professor or advisor. So the latter was the case for me. My main advisor was Ralph Weir, who just completed his PhD at Cambridge, and it was secondarily advised by Scruton. So I met with Ralph, I guess, once every couple weeks to discuss my progress and everything. And I met with Roger occasionally as well. So I got two different perspectives on my topic. It took me a while to decide what I was going to write about. Ralph and I went back and forth for a while, trying to sort that out. I was initially very interested in writing about Vic and Stein, because Ludwig Wittgenstein is probably my favorite philosopher, and I saw this as a good opportunity to write something about him, maybe about his two seemingly opposing theories on philosophy of language or logic, or even even aesthetics, intersecting his thought with other writings on aesthetics. But the more I thought about that, the more I wrote about that, the more that turned into a PhD caliber thesis, and I just didn't have the time to complete that in 1 year. So I ended up, I don't want to say settling with, but going with something more aesthetic and more focused than Vic and Stein, because Vic and Stein's thought about everything is very interconnected. You almost can't talk about what he said regarding the philosophy of language without talking about his philosophy of logic and philosophy of perception and art and even religious thinking. It's all very interconnected. So that would have been too big of a project. So I ended up focusing a little more on aesthetics, specifically the philosophy of humor and amusement. My thesis was entitled The Philosophy of Comedy, Amusement, Incongruity, and Morality. And it was in some ways very descriptive. I gave a general overview of the different terms I'd be using, differentiated between comedy, what comedy is, how that's different from humor more generally, and how those things are kind of founded in some form of amusement. And so I used amusement as the basis for what might be a necessary and sufficient condition for something to be considered funny or humorous or comical, was that it had to be amusing. And then that was the first chapter. In the second chapter, I talked about incongruity in particular being a necessary condition of humor. Incongruity is one of three theories in traditional philosophy of humor. The other two being superiority and relief. Superiority having kind of a postmodern background to it, and relief theory, relief from restraint theory, it's also called, having more of a psychological background to it. Freud wrote a lot about that. So I thought that those two other theories, they were maybe a little too interdisciplinary for my purposes, for the purposes of writing a master's thesis. So I kept it focused, and I claimed that on a philosophical basis, anyway, without necessary regard to superiority and relief, that incongruity was necessary but not sufficient for something to be humorous or funny. And what I mean by that is, or what I mean by incongruity, is something like what you expect out of a joke, out of the meaning of a joke, ends up being incongruous with what is actually concluded, say in the punchline. So you're set up to see the world one way, and then you end up seeing it another way. And there's incongruity in perception, if that makes sense. That's a shortcut way of describing that. Maybe I'll do another video on that in particular. And then anyway, the third chapter was about morality. I took a contemporary defense of superiority theory and I dismantled it. It was on Ronald D'Souza, who we might consider to be a sort of postmodern, even like Marxist thinker in academic philosophy today, gave an account of humor and its superiority basis, that if you find something humorous, you're necessarily looking down at that object of humor. You're claiming level of superiority over that thing. To laugh at something is to ridicule it, and that's necessarily a bad thing, he argues. So I argued against that generally, and again, I could do another video on this in more detail about why I think this is the case, but I sort of gave an account about the idea that humor is, because it's aesthetic, that it's in some ways not subject to moral scrutiny. It's unique, because something that's aesthetic in nature doesn't serve the purpose of proclaiming a position of power over another person or another object, even if we do seem to be putting that object down by laughing at it. There's a difference between laughing at and laughing with, if that makes sense. But something that's aesthetic in nature serves no purpose other than to be the best it can be for the sake of itself, you know? And that's sort of, I think, a widely accepted view of the nature of art in general, and music, and all of the arts. And so I kind of used that as one of my premises, you know, that theory of art. And if you disagree with the theory of art, then you'll probably disagree with the rest of my, you know, theory of humor and amusement in general. So anyway, that's just a little bit about my dissertation. I ended up passing that with a mark of merit. There are 4 marks, kind of like in the U.S. We have, in grad school anyway, it's A, B, C, or F. You can't pass with a D. You have to have at least a C in all coursework in grad school in order to get your degree. I passed with merit, which is equivalent to a B in the U.S., I guess. And I don't know, given the time restraints and my living conditions in London and in Europe for the year that I was there, I think I didn't deserve any more or any less than that. I think the equivalent to a B was just fine. Yeah, got my master's degree. I'm actually extracting some practical value out of that too, despite just kind of sitting on and being content with all that I learned in the seminars, which I did learn a lot, and I have a lot of notes that I can look back on anytime I'm thinking about one of those topics that we covered. I'm putting it to practical use. I did get a job as an adjunct instructor at a community college here in Louisiana, so I'm starting to teach. They were a little bit hesitant to accept my application because it was a research degree, not a traditional coursework degree. I didn't have a typical transcript, you know, with like grades for each course or each seminar. It was by research, and it was a lot of independent research. We would meet at the Reform Club in central London for our seminars, maybe once every 2 weeks, once every 3 weeks. And that was all of the, that was all that we had to do as far as like going to class, going to campus and things like that. I only had to go to the main campus of the University of Buckingham once for registration purposes, right at the very beginning. But everything else was in London. And there was actually one guy who was working and living in New York who was flying over for each seminar. He would commute. I think he had a pretty good job, so he was able to afford that. But that, you know, might be an option. They do have funding opportunities, and I'd say that you'd have to have, in order to get approved for funding, you'd have to have the equivalent to a first-class honors degree in the UK, which means probably like at least a 3.7 GPA, I guess. I didn't quite have that. I had equivalent to a second-class honors degree for my bachelor's, which was about 3.5 in my undergrad philosophy courses, and I think I had like a 3.3 or 3.2 overall GPA. So you can get accepted to this program without having a 4.0 if you come from the US. But I don't know, I highly recommend looking into it if you're interested in taking a philosophy master's degree. It's probably the best in the world. I really think that. And it's advised by the great Sir Roger Scruton. Not sure how much longer the program's going to be a thing. He's getting up there in age, but he stays very busy and very sharp. And there's no better well-rounded thinker to learn from than him, in my opinion, of all the philosophers that are alive today. He's written on every topic that you could possibly imagine in philosophy, and really, really great experience. Highly recommend it if you can if you can manage it. So that's my spiel on the master's degree by research at the University of Buckingham Humanities Research Institute. Highly recommend it if you're considering taking a philosophy master's. If you can afford to, make it out to London and gain that experience, you definitely won't regret it. All right. Y'all have a good day. Cheers.